This lesson is going to be covering some really core basic functionality with Google Apps Script, and then afterwards how we can select images from the web, also from the drive, and insert it into Sheets, also insert it into our docs. We're going to start out by making a spreadsheet and then making a folder, moving the spreadsheet into the folder and how those functions work. Next, we're going to select the image from its URL, get it as content, convert it into a blob, and then insert it into the spreadsheet. We're also going to be selecting the image from the internet, creating a file within our folder so that we can add the image directly within our Google Drive, and then how we can select the image from the Google Drive where we can move it into a folder, selecting the image from the drive, inserting it into the spreadsheet, how we can create a document and move it into the folder, and then lastly, how we can select the document that was created, add some content into it, and then specify where we're inserting the image, whether it's from a Google Drive image or whether it's a web image, and how you can insert those into the doc. So there's the example of the images inserted into the doc, and there's the example of the images inserted into the sheet. And this is all coming from a web image that's brought into our Google folder, and these are the files that we're going to be creating within this exercise. Go over to your Google Apps Script and create a brand new standalone script. So this script is going to be connecting to a spreadsheet, and we're actually going to make the spreadsheet within the script itself. So go ahead and give the script a name. I'm just going to call this as Sheets, name the script Sheets. And because this is a standalone script, it's going to be sitting within the drive on its own, and then I can always access it by going into my Google Drive and selecting the project and then opening up within the editor. And the first function that we're going to make is going to be a maker sheet. So this one is going to be making a brand new spreadsheet, and for now we're going to make it within the root of our Google Drive. So we're going to use the sheet object. So give it a variable name so that we can select the object once it's created, and using the spreadsheet app service. And then the create method, it's going to require one parameter, and that's going to be the spreadsheet name. So I'm going to call it new sheet 1. And within the logger log, we're going to output the sheet object and then get the ID of the sheet object, and then output that within the log once it's created. Select run in order to run the sheet. We're going to have to accept permissions for the script in order to run, and using the spreadsheet app service in order to create a brand new sheet, and going through the review permissions, selecting the Google account that we want to run the permissions with, and then advanced, and under advanced, selecting to go to the Sheets project, which is by the name of the Sheets, and then allowing the Sheets to edit, create, and delete all of your Google Sheets and spreadsheets. So that's giving the script permission in order to interact using your Google account into the spreadsheets. And what this does is this ran, it created a brand new spreadsheet within the drive and the root directory. And this is the ID that was used in order to create the sheet. We're going to select the ID because we want to use that in order to select the spreadsheet and be able to do more with the spreadsheet within the script. So you can select it from here, or you can go into the drive, select the sheet, and within the web URL of the sheet, you're going to be able to find the ID. The ID is the unique identifier for that spreadsheet. So that's going to give us a way in order to select and interact. So I'm going to create a global object, and that's going to just contain that spreadsheet information. If we want to create a folder and add the spreadsheet into a folder, so if we don't want it on our root drive, we're going to create a function, and I'm going to call it maker folder. So this function itself, we're going to create a folder, and then afterwards we're going to select the sheet, the spreadsheet, the new sheet 1, and move that into the folder. So selecting the Drive app service and then create folder, we want to select a name for the folder. So I'll call it new folder 1. And then just as we did for the spreadsheet, we're going to use the logger in order to select the ID of the spreadsheet or the folder. And then this is just going to be using the get ID for the folder. In the dropdown of the functions, select the maker folder, and we're going to run it and accept permissions. because now we're going to be using the Drive app. So we need to give the app the same permissions in order to create, edit, delete content on our Google Drive using this Google account and interacting with this application. You can also remove the permissions by going to myaccount.google.com/permissions, and there's a link down here where you select under the Google account, and that will open up all of the apps that you've given permissions to, and from there you could control and remove the permissions. So this is going to create the folder on the drive. So this is the folder ID, and let's go back into the drive, and we should see a folder that's created, and it's just called new folder 1. So go back into the sheets and create another file, and we're going to call this FID. So it's going to be a global variable, and this is going to be the folder ID. So what we want to do now is take the sheet that we've created and select that sheet, and then move the sheet into the folder that we've created. So we'll create a function, and I'm going to just call this mover. And what this function will do is it's going to get a sheet object. So we can get it by the ID, or we could create another sheet, and we'll move that in. And then I'll show you how you can select the existing sheet. So we're creating another spreadsheet, and it's going to have an ID for the spreadsheet. So we need to always select the sheet if we want to interact with it on the Drive app service. So get the ID of the sheet. So that's going to give us the ID of the sheet. And now what we want to do is get the file by ID and select where we want to move it into. So we already have the folder ID under the global value of FID. So we can use that within the application. And I'm going to create another variable called move drive. And this is going to be using the Drive app and get folder by ID. And we do have the ID of the folder, so that's the global value there, or you can hard code it or move it into the mover function. So this is going to be the destination drive, or I'll just rename it to des drive. So what we want to do is we want to use the Drive app service. We want to get files by ID. So get file by ID, and under the SID, where we got the ID of the file that we've selected, this is going to be where we can get the file. And then once we've selected the file, we want to run the function of move to, and this is also going to require an ID, and this is going to be what the destination drive ID is going to be. So running the mover function, first we're going to create a new spreadsheet, then we're going to get the ID of the spreadsheet, we're going to get the folder object by its ID, which we've already selected and created, and then we're using the Drive app to get the files by ID, and then we're moving this file into this destination folder. So let's run that function called mover and go into our Drive. So we've got a new folder, and there's our sheet that's been created into the folder. So going back into the script, I'm going to rename this to mover1, and I'll create the mover function where we're going to select an existing file and then take that existing file and move it into our destination folder. So we don't need to select the SID because we already have that as ID. And we can really simplify this by selecting these statements, and this is our destination drive. And you can even shorten this even more if you want it to just select that and put that into the move to, so you could put it within one statement. But we already have the ID of the global object of the file that we want to move. So we can just place that in to the function. And now when we run mover, it's going to take the sheet called sheet 1, which we initially created, and move it into the folder 1. So that's how you can create a spreadsheet and then select that spreadsheet file by its ID, also create a folder and select the folder by its ID, and then you can move the files as needed. So we also want to add content into the spreadsheet. So within the spreadsheet 1 is the sheet that we're going to be working with. So this is just a default sheet. The first sheet on the page is going to be named sheet 1. And we're going to be selecting a file, which is going to be an image file that's sitting on the web. We're going to select it by its URL and bring that into the spreadsheet. So the URL for the image, this is going to be where the image is located. And that's sitting on one of my servers where we've just got a regular image that we're going to add in and add it into the spreadsheet. And I call this adder1 since we're going to be adding an image from the web into the spreadsheet. So let's go ahead and we're going to open up the spreadsheet object. So we want to select the destination sheet. And this is where we can use the spreadsheet app and then we're going to open it by ID. And we have the ID listed here globally. So this is why the ID is really important, because if you ever want to interact with the file, we can always select it by ID. So we're opening it by ID, and over here is where we were able to select it and move it by its ID. So that's selecting the sheet object file. And we can also select a sheet. So we want to just select whatever the first sheet is. So using the spreadsheet object, we can use the get sheets. And what get sheets will do is it's going to return the array of so we know we only have just the one sheet. So we want to interact with whatever the first sheet is. So let's first run adder and we get the sheet object within the array. So if we select it and using the index value of 0, this should allow us to select the first sheet as an object. And here I'll get the name of the sheet so that we can just confirm that the name is going to be whatever the name of the first sheet is. So even if I change it, it'll automatically go into that first sheet object. So run it, and there's our sheet, new name. So whatever it is currently named, it's just going to select the first sheet in the order. If I add more sheets, and if I run the script, if I move sheet 2 to be the first sheet within the sheet array, it's going to select that sheet and use that sheet. So that's how you can select it. You can also select the sheets by name. And in this case, we're just selecting the first one because we're just creating it. And by default, it's going to be named sheet 1. But you can also select it this way, or you could select it by name. So as long as you've got the sheet object, that allows you to insert content into the sheet. So now once we've got the sheet object, we can do an append row. And the content within the row is added in using an array format. So the first line or first column is going to be the first item within the array, and you can go all the way down. So this will add in a row of values from 1 to 5. So let's run adder again, and this will just add it to whatever the first sheet is. There's our content that's been added. So we want to do the same idea where we're adding in content, but we want to add in an image. So first of all, we want to be able to get the image as an object. So let's run through the code in order to get the image object. And I'm going to just call this my image. We'll use the URL fetch app, and then using the fetch method in order to fetch content from a URL. And we do have the URL of where the image is located. So it's going to be looking for an image on the web at that location. And then we want to get the image data. So I'm going to get the image as a data object. And maybe I can just call this image URL or image. And then we want to turn it into a data object. So get the image object and then get the contents of the image. So that's going to get it as a content object. And then using the utilities, we can turn it into a blob. So right now, once we get the data, so if we were to log out the data, just show you what gets logged out. And once again, we've added new functionality into the app. So it's going to require new permissions since we're using the URL fetch app service. And that's going to be the connect to external service, which is being allowed to the Google account. Running the script. So there's our image data. So it's quite a bit that gets returned back there. And that's the image object as data. So that's getting the entire contents as a binary data output. And then once we've got it as a binary object, we can use the utilities and use the new blob to get my data and convert it into an image. And let's do a PNG image. So image PNG. And then we want to give the image a name, and that will be the name of the image that gets created. So it's going to create a blob for the image. And once we have it within a blob format, we can select the sheet object and use the insert image method. And once we have it as a blob, we can insert the blob source, which is the blob, and then which column and which row we want to insert it at. So inserting it as the column first. So we want to insert it into the first column and the second row. So that's where we're adding the image into. And we've got the blob, which is the image, as an object. So let's run the code. Go over to the sheet, and there's our web image that's been inserted into our spreadsheet. And that's inserted within the first column and the second row. And we don't actually need to output the logger information. Let's try that again, and we're going to insert it as the third row, first column, or we can add in another value there. So fourth column, third row, and run it again. So it's going to insert a second image at that location within the spreadsheet. And within the spreadsheets, the images are going to be floating out of the cells. So this is going to be just where the default positioning of the image is going to be located. So even if you had content within the cells, the image is going to be floating on top of that content, because that's going to be the location of the image. And that's the default one where we're inserting it on the page. If you have the image on the drive, so let's first of all, we'll grab the image, and that's going to be the same image that we're using on the web, and we'll put it onto the drive. So this will be a function, and function, we can just call that maker image. And this is going to be getting the image from the web URL. So it's going to be using the same format as we have here, where we get it within a blob format. And once it's within a blob format, we can actually create a file out of the image. So we're using the fetch URL fetch app, fetch, getting it from its location on the web, and then getting the content as data, and then selecting that data using the new blob. And this data is the same as you see with the base 64 for the images, and converting it into a usable blob format, which is converting it and creating it into an image. And next, what we want to do is we want to create a file and create the image on the folder. So I'll just call it img, and using the Drive app service, we're going to create a file, and the file that we're creating is going to be sourced from the blob. And then within the logger log, we'll output the file, and we'll get the ID from the file and output that within the logger. So run maker image, and it's selecting the file. So this is the ID of the file. If we go back out to the root folder, so there's our image, and we can open it up as its PNG image. And now we've got the URL, or the file value of the image, so image ID, and we can just share that globally so that we can access it within our function. So the same idea, if we want to place it within a particular folder, just as we did below where we had the mover file, we can do the mover as well, the same way as we did it before, where we can move it into the destination. And I'll call this mover 2. We're getting the folder by its folder ID, and then we're getting the image by its file ID, and we're moving it over to the destination folder. So this is going to be taking that image and moving it into our folder, which was the new folder. So there's the image now. It's moved into the new folder. And if we want to take this image and insert it into our spreadsheet, and this is going to be coming from the drive instead of from the web. So we can do that as well, where we can select it and insert it into the sheet. So let's go ahead, and where we've got the adder, we're just going to call this adder 2. So adder 2, as it's going to be adding the file from the drive into the spreadsheet. And a lot of the code is going to be very similar, where we're going to be selecting the sheet by its ID. So we already have the ID from earlier, where we're got the using the spreadsheet app service opened by ID. We're selecting the first sheet, and I'm just going to move sheet number 2 to be the first sheet. So we'll be inserting this new image, and this one is going to be coming from our drive and adding that into the spreadsheet. So we want to be able to select the image object, And we can use the Drive app service where we get file by ID, and then we already have the image ID. So we can also do a combination where we're selecting it, creating the file, and then we can get the ID of the file, and then that way we can use that file object in order to insert it in the same way as we did before within the blob format. So there's a number of ways that we can do that, but because we've got the ID, we're going to go ahead and we're going to get the file by ID and then use the get blob method in order to turn it into a blob. And then once it's within a blob format, just as we did with the other adder, we can use the insert image into the sheet, setting the column and the row where we want to insert it. So let's set it by column 1, row number 6. We're inserting the image, and this image, we can also call it blob so that it's consistent. So you can give it whatever name makes sense, but in this case, so we're consistent using the variable name of blob, and we're inserting that image. So save the function, select adder2, and this time the image that's being inserted is coming from our folder. And with images, how they are handled within the Google Drive, they just use the ID in order to handle the images. And there's our image inserted at column number 1 and row number 6 into the first spreadsheet. So if we did something like column number 10, row number 6, and we could insert the image once again, and there's the image, the script running, inserting the image within the spreadsheet. So that's how you could insert images that have a file name, file ID that are located on your drive, and use those and add them into the spreadsheet. So there's going to be one more exercise where we're going to be selecting and creating a document and then adding it into the document. So let's try that, where we're going to do maker doc. And what this function is going to be doing is it's going to create a doc, so document object. So using the document app and create method, my doc. So it's going to create a document just as we saw before. And within the logger, we'll take the doc and get the ID, we get ID, in order to get the ID of the document that just gets created. And by default, if you don't specify the folder, it will create it within the root of the folder. And then you can select it just as we did before where we were moving the file. So once we've got the file ID, we can move it into the destination folder. So we're going to add this function in here as well. We're going to create the document and then get the folder where we want to insert the document, and then add the document by its ID and moving it into the destination folder. So this should be as one function that's going to create the document and drop it into the My folder. And we're going to have to accept permissions again because we're using the document app service. So once again, select the account, advanced, go to the project, and add in the new set of permissions for the script in order to manage it. And there's our ID of the document. Let's go over to the folder, and there's the document that's been created. So what we want to do is we want to select this document by its ID. And if you don't output the ID, you can always go over to the URL and select the ID from the web URL. And that's one of the easiest ways to get the ID of the doc. So let's set the doc ID and add that into our global values. So it's easy to select the particular document that we want to work with. And so what we want to do now is we want to get the image and insert the image into the project. And just as we've done before, we can insert the image, getting the document app, and then getting the blob. So adder doc, and we're going to add the image into the doc. So first off, let's go select our document object, and using the document app get, or actually we're going to open by ID, and we have the doc ID that we've got from the document that we've created. Next, we need to get the image as a blob, so we can get the file or we can get it from the web URL. So let's get the image as a blob, and this is going to be coming from the drive, just as we saw earlier. And now we've got it within a blob format. Get the body of the document. If you want to update the document, you get the body. And then within the body, this is where we can insert an image. And using the insert image, we just need to specify the blob source. We can also insert it at a particular index, so within the child index, and that will specify where we're inserting it. The index is which element we want to insert it. We're going to run the adder doc, and the reason that the insert image doesn't work is because we have to specify where we want to insert it. So that's using the index value of where we're inserting the image. So once you specify which element you want to insert the image into, it will add that image into that particular location. So you need to specify a location, just as you did with the spreadsheet, of where you want to insert that image. And if you've got a bunch of content there, body and a append paragraph, and we'll add a bunch of paragraphs in using the value of I, and then we'll insert the image somewhere in the middle on element number 5. So go ahead and run that again. So there's our 5th element, gets the image inserted, because the first one is here, then the second one is just blank, then we've got the test 0, 1, 2, so that's the 5th one, and there's the image that's been inserted in the 5th slot. So once we run it again, it will insert the other image exactly at that same spot, so adding in another version of the image, and there's our test creating additional paragraphs within the doc. So that's how you can get an image. You can also get it from the web as a blob, and then insert the blob into your Google Doc, all using Google Apps Script.